So, welcome back, and we're pleased to have Martin for this presentation. So, Martin Hagger is professor at the University of California, Merced, and also at the University of
Vascular.
Cheers. And we will have a talk about imagery and planning interventions, interacting effects in health behavior context, and some suggestion for digital intervention physical activity. Martin, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alex. Hello, Grenoble. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the nice day that you ordered. As Alex introduced, I'm from California, and I'm traveled here from California. So unfortunately, even though it's the afternoon outside, it's 6:30 in the morning for me, and I've been up all night. So I'll try to sound authoritative in my presentation, but I apologize if I seem a little bit sleepy. Seriously, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for Aina and for Alex for inviting me to come and talk to you today. And it's really nice to see good friends and colleagues and some family as well visiting Grenoble. So I'm going to be talking today about some interventions that we've been developing using an interaction of two different behavior change techniques, imagery and planning. And I'll talk a little bit about how we've used those to try and change behavior at the group level, and also make some suggestions as to how they might be applied in the physical activity context for digital interventions. So here's an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to introduce imagery interventions. I'm going to introduce planning interventions and a particular type of planning intervention known as implementation intentions. I'm pretty sure some of you will be familiar with those kinds of techniques. Then I'll be talking about how we've utilized these synergistically to change behavior in a number of different behavioral contexts. And I'll give you 3 examples in alcohol reduction, reducing drivers' behavior in driving through floodwater, and also in the context of COVID-19 prevention behaviors. Now, those of you who are observant may notice that none of these interventions are in the area of physical activity, which may seem slightly unusual in a symposium on physical activity. However, I will talk a little bit about digital interventions as a mode of delivery, as a component of behavior change methods, and I'll outline some of the implications for these kinds of intervention techniques for physical activity interventions using digital modes of delivery. If you have any questions while I'm going along, please feel free to shout out. Okay, so what is imagery? Well, actually, it's a very well used strategy, particularly in areas such as business and in performance, for example, in sport. But surprisingly, it hasn't been used very often, very frequently in the area of health behavior change. And that is changing though. So imagery is an umbrella term for a number of strategies or techniques that are used to change behavior, enhance performance, and like I said, it has this long history. And it involves imagining or mentally rehearsing performing a future behavior, and one that is valued or desired by the individual. There are a number of different types. There are facilitator or practitioner guided types of intervention, known as guided imagery or functional imagery training. And there's also this other strategy known as mental simulations. That's the one I'm going to concentrate on today. So, what are mental simulations? Well, this is one specific type of imagery interventions or visualization interventions. And it involves an individual imagining or visualizing doing a particular action, target action, and the resultant outcome of that action. So there are 2 types of mental simulation. Process, thinking about the steps toward that behavior and achieving that outcome, and outcome mental simulations, which is imagining the outcome, achieving the outcome, and the feelings of satisfaction that one achieves or feels when one has achieved that desired outcome. And so process mental simulations focus on these precise steps, the actual process of undertaking all the steps that are necessary to engage in that behavior, and the outcome is, again, thinking about achieving the goal or the intended outcome, but importantly, imagining how one would feel, feelings of positive emotions, satisfaction, and so forth, as a result of attaining that outcome. And those mental simulations need to be relevant, detailed, very clear in the mind of the individual, and visceral in order to be most effective. I'll get on to what makes these interventions most effective later on. So, mental simulations was this type of imagery that was first put forward by Pham and Taylor back in the end of the 90s. And here's an example of a script that was presented to those who needed to image in order to change their behavior, participants in their study. Now, their first study was in the context of studying behavior. It was a student sample, and of course the behavior is therefore extremely relevant. And you can see this is the outcome mental simulations. So it gets the target audience to visualize attaining the outcome, attaining the goal of the intervention. In this case, it was getting a high grade on your psychology midterm exam paper. And you can see it's very important that one of the important things that they emphasize, or issues that they emphasize, is to actually visualize those outcomes. And then the process mental simulation asks individuals, prompts individuals to think about those steps to obtaining the outcomes. And actually, people do intuitively use imagery in everyday life. And if you think about it, many times when you're thinking about your day ahead, for example, you visualize yourself doing certain things and taking the steps that are required in order to achieve the kinds of things you want to achieve during the day. However, in the difference between that sort of casual imagining or visualization and these kinds of mental simulation interventions is that it's very much formalized. It's very, there's this clear format as to how you might image, and a person is supposed to engage in the imagery in an environment where they are focused entirely on that specific behavior, or in this case, that's the specific outcome. So I did mention that mental imagery interventions or mental simulation interventions are relatively sparsely used within the health psychology, behavior change literature, but they're not completely absent. And so my colleague Dominic Comroy and I conducted a meta-analysis of imagery interventions that have been used in the area of health behavior change. And you can see that the imagery interventions had a small sized effect on changing behavior and changing intentions. There was also effect on psychological constructs that are purported to be involved in the mechanism of action as to how these simulation or these imagery interventions work. And the majority of the studies were in these kinds of health behaviors: physical activity, diet, and alcohol. Importantly, analyzing all of these studies enabled us to also to explore the sorts of conditions that determined the strength of the effect of imagery interventions. And you can see here some of those conditions or moderators. Imagery interventions were much more effective if there was more than one imagery intervention. So there was a follow-up component beyond the initial imagery exercise. In other words, participants participated in more bouts or a higher dose of the intervention, giving people detailed instructions on how to image or conduct their mental simulation or visualization intervention or exercise led to more effective interventions. And in fact, those who did not provide any instructions, the intervention had no averaged overall effect. Older participants were more effective than younger participants, much more effective. You can ask me later if you want to know exactly my hypothesis as to why that might be. And of course, studies using longer duration interventions were more effective. Unsurprising, because greater dose led to greater immersion in the imagery intervention and in the exercises. So imagery interventions seem to be effective, and particularly effective when under certain conditions, particularly conditions related to, dose of the effect and also the duration of the effect. So what is the mechanism of action? How do these imagery interventions work and operate in changing behavior? Well, here's a basic model as to how a behavior change intervention might work. When we look at the efficacy of intervention trials, generally we're looking at the influence of some sort of method, content of an intervention, a behavior change technique, on the behavioral outcome. So that sort of relationship there. But the mechanism of action implies that there's some sort of change, psychological change in this context, that occurs and is responsible to carry that intervention effect. So those psychological mediators can be derived from psychological theories. And we've seen and heard quite a lot about certain types of psychological theories and models that have been used to try to guide behavior change interventions. Self-determination theory, for example, the health action process model, and so approach, and so on. So here's some ideas as to how imagery interventions work. This sort of middle pathway here suggests that imagery interventions impact behavior by changing people's self-efficacy. The mechanism there comes from Bandura's work looking at modeling, and in particular vicarious experience. And if you know a little bit about Bandura's ideas, that if you observe somebody else performing a behavior, it provides you with a guide as to how to do it, but it also fills you with confidence in order to perform it in the future. Greater self-efficacy. Now, in the case of imagery, if you imagine yourself performing the behavior, you become a self-model. So the idea is that it's a mechanism through vicarious experience. Mental simulations are proposed, or one of the proposed mechanisms for mental simulations. The imagery intervention affects behavior by changing emotion regulation. And in fact, what Pham and Taylor demonstrated is that individuals who engaged in these mental simulation exercises had lower levels of anxiety when performing the behavior in future. So they had lower levels of somatic responses, emotional responses. And again, that relates back to social cognitive theory. Somatic responses is another source of self-efficacy, because people who have lower levels of anxiety are not distracted by concerns or worries outside their person. Similarly, there's a sort of cognitive explanation as to why mental imagery interventions work, and that is by highlighting the salient cues that might line up the behavior. So 3 mechanisms by which mental imagery, mental simulations may work in changing behavior. So again, that relates back to that sort of overarching basic model of a behavior change technique or behavior change intervention. So just moving away from imagery interventions, another behavior change technique, and this time one with a very well-trodden path in terms of basic evidence for their support, are planning interventions. And I'm going to look at one particular version, which is known as implementation intentions or action plans. And again, this comes from the model of action phases proposed by Gollwitzer and Heckhausen way back in the 90s, and, from basic research proposed by Howard Leventhal and co-workers. And the idea is that these kinds of plans facilitate people enacting their good intentions. Many of you will have heard the so-called intention-behavior gap. People often say that they will do some sort of behavior. They'll talk about their New Year's resolutions, and so they'll have a clear intention, perhaps, to change their behavior. But when it comes to the crunch, they don't necessarily follow through on those good intentions or those plans. So Gollwitz has suggested that one way to enhance people's enactment of their intention is to furnish those intentions with additional plans, particularly plans that link some sort of environmental contingency, like a cue, with the behavior itself. And so that's why he called them if-then plans. So if a certain situation or contextual cue arises in your environment, then you match it through forming the implementation intentions, you are more likely to perform that behavior when the cue arises. Okay, so it's a way of trying to link things in your environment that appear regularly with the behavior that you want to change, that you intend to change. So the idea is, if some sort of situation arises, I will do behavior X. And the condition is a context, a situation, a prompt, a cue, something in your environment that is likely to remind you of the behavior. And what you need to do when you're prompted to form implementation intentions is to explicitly make that association. Often that's associated, for example, with writing it down, or in some forms, collaborating with others to enhance the recall of that behavior and enhance the link between that behavior and the cue. And that's actually the mechanism by which implementation intentions are purported to work in changing behavior, by assisting recall of the intended action, but also linking it to this cue, making that link between the cue more effective, more efficient, a bit like a habit. What does an implementation intention look like? Well, here's a text-based depiction of what an implementation intention looked like. So you can see a person is prompted to state an if or a cue, and they're also prompted to state the actual behavior that's linked to that cue. And so here's a very mundane example, but an example that might be somebody in their workplace might suggest. When a certain time arises, a certain time of day, which is going to happen during one's day, then they pair that with the specific behavior that they want to change. And you can see there's also some very specific information about the behavior as well. And that's very important because it's important to have that level of specificity. As we know from research on social cognition models, the need to be very specific, very clear in terms of action, target, context, and time when you are specifying the kinds of behaviors that you're interested in. It's no good having sort of vague notions. When this contingency happens, I'll just do some exercise. It's too vague. So what I'm going to do now is give you a few examples of some of the research that we've done fusing these two types of interventions. Now, why is that salient or important? Well, if you look at models of action phases, dual phase type models, they suggest that behavior change changing behavior is more likely to occur if people are not only motivated to change, but also if they have augmented that motivation, that intention, with these plans. So if we can change people's both their motivation, their level of intensity or intention for performing the behavior, alongside furnishing that with these plans, we may be able to synergistically increase their participation in the behavior. So here is the design of our intervention. So this was, I just realized that was actually me. I was pushing this button. So this is the design of our intervention. So it's a 2x2 design where we prompted, in this case, students who were drinking excessively in the United Kingdom. Not a surprise. And we prompted them to mentally image, reducing their alcohol intake. And we also provided them with a prompt to form a plan when and where they would do so. And so what you got was individuals who received a mental simulation, right? So a motivational type intervention only. So they were prompted to form this imagery to reduce their alcohol consumption, or they had a implementation intention intervention only. So they were prompted to form this action plan alone to perform the behavior. Those who received both and those who received neither. So here's an example of the intervention materials. I'm sorry it's a bit small, but I can make these slides available to you if you want them after the session. So we had one exercise where we got them to perform an imagery or perform an imagery exercise, and also to write it down. And that was important. Not only does it help reinforce the imagery after they've imagined performing the behavior and achieving the outcome, but it also serves as a fidelity check. Did they image in the way that we expected them to? So we content analyzed those notes that participants were prompted to make in their imagery exercise. And then in this planning exercise, you can see we prompted them very specifically to form these if-then plans. And you can see this was way back when I was still working in the United Kingdom. And so this is a bit of ancient history. But we had both of these exercises, and you'll notice it's delivered in a pen and paper format. Okay, so we used print versions of these and presented them to individuals, these students who were drinking excessively. We also measured some of the psychological constructs at baseline before the intervention and then after the intervention that we thought would be implicated in the intervention, specifically attitudes, perceived behavioral control or self-efficacy, and also a level of planning. You notice that this particular version of the intervention is for the combined group. So this is participants who received both the imagery intervention and the planning intervention. So this is a structural equation model, actually a path analysis, looking at the effects of the intervention on our follow-up variable, which were these alcohol intake at follow-up, a second follow-up. That isn't me. I'm not doing anything. So as you can see, we have the baseline alcohol intake as controls on the subsequent follow-up. And we also have baseline intentions. And you can see, importantly, that the planning and the motivational or imagery intervention both had main effects on alcohol intake, negative because we were aiming to reduce alcohol intake. But importantly, we also had a significant interaction effect. And so we not only had the main effects, but also the interaction effects. So that's the first example. Second example is looking at reducing people's motivation or intention to perform or to not drive when the road is flooded. Now, this is a very specific behavior, but it's very pertinent in the context in which we conducted it. So this was conducted with my colleagues, one of whom is here, Kyra Hamilton, who led the project, in Australia, where you get these very rapidly developing flood situations on the roads because of very heavy rainfall in a short period of time. So, for example, somebody might drive to work on their regular route and it'll be completely dry, and then they might be driving home at the end of the day and it will have been raining and the road will be flooded. And it is extremely risky to drive through floodwater. Even a very shallow amount of floodwater can lead to a car being lifted off the ground and overturning. And there are fatalities, of course, as well as heavy costs involved with driving through floodwater. And the message is, don't do it, even if you think you can. Interestingly, there's a massive gender disparity in those people who tend to drive through floodwaters and those who don't. Males tend to be much more likely to drive through floodwaters than females. Read into that what you will. Okay. So it's a very serious behavior, a behavior that has very serious consequences. And Kyra and I and a group from universities in Australia conducted these studies in collaboration with the Royal Life-Saving Society. Thank you. I was going to say institute. I had an institute in my head. Royal Life-Saving Society in Australia. And they are one of the organizations which is very responsible for messaging around driving through floodwater and prevention of those kinds of fatalities. So what we wanted to do was to try and encourage these kinds of people to image these kinds of scenarios or situations and use that as a basis to change their behavior. So we did some pilot work identifying the sort of kinds of beliefs and messages that we thought might be effective in changing those beliefs. And then we conducted an intervention, again, using imagery as well as planning as a way to enhance people's motivation and their actual plans to reduce the likelihood of them driving through floodwater in the future. And our primary outcome was intention to drive through floodwater, right? Because it is very challenging to get some in situ behavior for floodwaters, because we don't know when the floods are necessarily going to happen. But also our secondary outcomes were these psychological mediators through which we expected the intervention to work, particularly around sort of attitudes, perceptions of control, and self-efficacy. And so we had this pilot data that we collected from Australian residents, and this was a survey and a semi-structured interview to try and elicit those beliefs. What I'm going to be focusing on in this presentation is this second study, which is focusing on this intervention, using imagery to change motivation and using planning to promote conversion of those motives or their intentions into actual behavior. And so we had anonymous online surveys of these Australian residents, quite a large-scale study, and we used this sort of double-blind procedure, so those collecting the data and those performing the tasks didn't know what the purpose of the study was. Here's the study design, and this study was delivered using an online intervention delivery. So we had a web-based intervention delivery. So participants received measures of the psychological constructs. They had a welcome video. They were randomly allocated to the intervention, the control condition, and the intervention condition contained exercises which introduced individuals to the idea of not driving through floodwater and rationale behind that, some educational information. In addition to that, it also included practice on mental imagery, followed by the mental imagery exercise that prompted people to visualize not driving through floodwater, turning around, for example, if the road is flooded, and then also a plan to do so. And so we had this sort of intervention group and this control group that only received the education, so they didn't receive the planning and the imagery exercise. Then we had follow-up surveys, and 4 weeks later, a further survey measuring those outcomes, and in particular our primary outcome, which was intention change. And so here are the intervention materials. They're online. We actually employed an actor to talk the participants through the imagery and planning exercises, and also through a practice imagery exercise, which is a sort of very visceral exercise, getting people to image cutting through a lemon, and ask them to sort of visualize the emotions and the feelings that they get when doing so, because it affects people's senses. And then you had these process imagery and outcome imagery planning and planning mental simulation interventions. So the intervention led to changes in intentions, significant reductions in norms for performing the behavior, perceived norms, and also increased action planning and with respect to avoiding driving through floodwaters. We also had changes in intentions and norms post-intervention for the control group, but not at follow-up, not at the time 3 follow-up. So it seems that for the intervention condition, we had an effective, or the intervention was effective in changing people's plans or intentions to drive through floodwaters. And you can read all about that study in that paper there. We also did some further exploratory analyses and demonstrated that intentions and subjective norm change was stronger or larger in males, probably because they had much further to go in terms of change, as I intimated earlier. And the intervention effects on post-intervention, perceived behavior control, self-efficacy, and so on, was much greater for those with low or modest baseline intention. So it's more effective for those who were sort of lowish in terms of their intentions to drive through water, or low intentions not to drive through floodwater. So it seems it's more effective in those who had further to go. And again, that was exacerbated in this gender moderator. So that's the second example. Third example, we used this strategy in the context of COVID-19 preventive behaviors. So the pandemic offered the opportunity for us to examine whether these strategies worked in this particular context. And again, this is with colleagues in Australia, and was led by a graduate student, PhD student at Griffith University. So again, we were focusing on a behavior that is likely to lead to effective outcomes, that is preventing the spread of COVID-19 infections. And so our target primary outcome was changing the frequency with which people touch their face with unwashed hands, right, which is obviously a key way in which infection spreads, particularly this infection, and also hand hygiene behaviors. So we had this sort of pre-registered randomized controlled trial, and we had a 3-group design, and we had a persuasive communication, which is again sort of education focused, introducing the idea of why one needs the rationale as to why one needs to increase their hand washing behavior, reduce face touching behavior with unwashed hands. And then we had these imagery and planning strategies next to this education only message, which was the control group. And our primary outcome were these sort of self-reported hand hygiene behaviors, and the secondary outcomes were the social cognition mediators, theory-based mediators, through which we expected these intervention effects to work. So here's an example of some intervention materials that we had. And again, this was delivered online. So participants received these messages via an online presentation managed by survey software. So sort of fairly low tech compared to some of the digital interventions using mobile phone apps that you've been hearing about earlier, but digital and online nevertheless. And you can get these materials if you want online. These are freely available. So here's a snapshot of some of the findings from this study. In particular, change in those hand hygiene, face-touching hygiene behaviors was much greater in the implementation intention and imagery intervention compared to the education and control. Most importantly, this was for participants with low risk perceptions. The effects of the intervention were much weaker for those with high risk perceptions. In other words, people who were already perceived themselves as high risk for COVID-19 infections weren't affected by the intervention. In many respects, that's not surprising. These people are already probably changing their behavior, and therefore the intervention is probably less effective in those groups. In other words, very similar to the floodwater example, they had less far to go in terms of their change. Whereas those with low risk perceptions didn't see themselves at risk of COVID-19 behavior. Their behavior was substantially changed, particularly by this implementation, intention, and imagery exercise. So much of the research that we've conducted, including this kind of research, has tended to focus on the effectiveness or the efficacy of these behavior change techniques. And as I outlined earlier, and this is just a more elaborated version, annotated version of that basic model of a behavior change intervention and how it works, its mechanism of action through these sort of psychological mediators. And so a lot of the research that we have done, particularly the research that I just introduced, demonstrated the effects of the behavior change techniques, imagery and planning, on the behavior change outcome, but also the effect here of the method on the modifiable factor, these psychological variables that are theoretically supposed to change and lead to the behavior change, or responsible for the behavior change. And so this diagram, if you like, illustrates that. One thing that we didn't do in these interventions, which would be important to do, is also to check that there is this mediation effect as well. And to do that, we would need to demonstrate change in these modifiable factors and change in the behavior concomitant with change introducing the technique. One thing we haven't focused on in any great detail is the mode of delivery. Now, a lot of the kinds of things we've been talking about and hearing about today is very much immersed in this idea of mode or medium for delivering behavior change interventions. So using mobile phone apps, using online delivery, compared to other modes of delivery, for example, between a practitioner and a client, or via, for example, other media type messages, for example, posters or television advertisements, or just pen and paper advertisements, like the example I gave with the alcohol intervention. Those comparisons are actually seldom made. So, as Dombrowski and co-workers argued, and many others have argued, that actually the mode of delivery is another active ingredient. It's another behavior change strategy, effectively, or should be viewed at the level of behavior change strategy, that needs to be considered when planning, developing, and interpreting the evidence for behavior change interventions. And the comparisons that I just spoke about, very seldom done. Very few behavior change interventions make systematic comparisons between interventions, the same interventions with the same method and techniques in an online or mobile phone digital type delivery method with other types of methods, for example, client practitioner and so on. And that seems fundamental to me, because we really do want to demonstrate that the intervention effectiveness is much greater than other modes of delivery. And there's an argument in favor of doing that, because mobile phone, digital type interventions are much more cost effective than having a practitioner, a therapist, a facilitator, somebody who is paid, right, to facilitate or to lead the intervention. And if we can demonstrate the effectiveness is as good as, or close to as good as, the more expensive intervention, then we have clear evidence that talks to this idea of cost effectiveness, for example. And of course, there are other benefits as well, relating to digital interventions, for example, high accessibility and so on. So that's really important, and we don't do it as researchers. So I think that is a key message from these kinds of research. And you know, I'm as guilty as anybody. I haven't made these comparisons myself in the research that I've done, but it occurs to me that this is something that we do need to do. I'm not saying it's not being done at all. I'm just saying that it's very seldom. It's a rare commodity in this context. And so, yes, this just sort of summarizes what I've just said in terms of mode of delivery as the sort of key moderator. And interesting, if you look back at the imagery interventions that I looked at, none of those comparisons, in the meta-analysis, none of those comparisons were made. And so we have these advantages of online delivery, as I mentioned before, in terms of their enhancement, their cost effectiveness, and so on, ability to check fidelity, ability to monitor more. I've heard a lot about the kinds of data, the really visceral and highly detailed, high resolution data that digital modes of delivery offer. These are big advantages, but we also need to show that their efficacy is comparable. And there's also other future applications, right? So there's definitely a need for longer-term interventions. These interventions I've presented to you earlier, using this hybrid between these sort of motivational imagery techniques and planning techniques, have tended to be very short-term, relatively short-term, weeks and months rather than months and years. And then also looking at greater engagement or reinforcement. So can we increase the engagement of people with these kinds of digital delivery interventions? One of the things that, I don't have any hard data on this, but one of the things that intuitively occurs to me is that many of the digital interventions that use mobile phones, particularly for younger generation, and again, I might be at risk of stereotyping here, don't focus enough on how people generally use those kinds of devices. So for example, delivering messages via smartphone apps. If you look at the way in which people generally tend to use those kinds of apps, it's very rapid. People are conditioned to flick through mobile phone data and mobile phone information and through apps on their phone, particularly younger people. And again, this is just anecdotal evidence. And my concern is that many of the interventions perhaps don't have the high fidelity that we want. In other words, the high engagement that we want is because we're giving people too much detailed information on these apps, and there is not enough engagement. They're not, the participants, the target audience is not engaged enough because of the way in which they've been conditioned to use the device or use the application. That's just a hunch. I haven't got no hard data on that, but that's just a hunch. That might be one consideration that needs further exploration, for example. Okay, so I want to thank all of the people who have contributed to this work. My team in UC Merced, my colleagues in Griffith, and of course, special thanks to my late great colleague Nikos Hadjizarantis, and my colleague Adam Lonsdale. And I would like to thank you for listening. Too kind.
Many thanks, Martin. Yeah.
Thanks for the great talk. I have a question on the mental imagery.
Sure.
So your meta-analysis showed that there was a dose-response relation, and so greater exposure led to greater effects. And maybe I've missed it when you had the flood intervention. I don't know how long each phase lasted and how many of these mental imagery exercises they had to do. But I was also wondering if if you think of like phobia treatment, you get desensitization exercises. And so mental imagery there, I guess, is used to reduce the affect you feel. And so I was wondering if you expect like a linear relation or a curvilinear relation, or more like a decreased effects.
Like a plateau.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's right. I think I think this is true for a lot of these kinds of interventions. It's a really good point. Is that there is a danger or a tendency for some level of habituation to the technique itself. But I think in the case of these we're not talking about people doing these sort of imagery interventions sort of hourly. It's more like daily. And the idea is to reinforce the idea. And over time, particularly if there's this link between the cue or the environmental contingency and the behavior, the idea is that that happens, and therefore there is no need that occurs, and there's no further need because the person develops, for example, a habit of doing so. So there's no further need for the exercise itself. But that said, we don't have very good data on that. We don't have the kinds of high-resolution data in terms of time series that was discussed in some of the earlier presentations. So I can't talk from a position of strength there. That's just my sort of hunch.
And maybe if you interlace it with behavior, I mean, like in sports, you might imagine I'm gonna have this match, and you prepare for it, and then you have the match, and then you might continue.
Yeah.
For the next match. But if you don't have the situation or the behavior in between, my guess would be that just the mental exercise would lose its strength.
Yes, you're right. That's a good point. And actually, one way that might help facilitate that would be to ensure or to try to work into the intervention some sort of reflection, so that people were able to reflect on their performance of the behavior. And then that in itself, then you get a level of self-monitoring of the behavior over time, which then relates back to the technique itself. So yeah, that would be a good, and again, that would be a good study. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. Not sleepy at all, full of vitality. My question is about the added value of this combined effect, because in the first study, there was the same regression coefficient for the implementation of tension and for the combined implementation and tension,
yes, yeah,
and mental imagery. And I think there was only a follow-up measure, a post-test measure. And in the second study, the difference between the groups was in the duration. So do you think that the added value of this combination is in the duration? That's my first question. And the second one is the translation in a complex behavior, such as physical activity, because in the last two studies you presented, maybe we can say that it's not as complex a change behavior as physical activity maybe. Yes. Do you think it's a moderator of the effects?
Yeah, I mean, that's two very good points. I think in terms of the first one, I think it's very much dependent on the group and the level of motivation, right? So one of the assumptions that this makes, or this kind of interactive approach makes, is that you have people with relatively low in motivation, and that you also, once you've motivated them, or you've enabled them to form an intention or a motive to perform the behavior, you then furnish that with a plan. Now, it's possible you might get a whole bunch of people who are already highly motivated, in which case the motivation intervention may not have that much of an effect. And it's actually the planning effect that has the high efficacy. What's more likely is that you get a group of people where there's variability within the sample, right, of their motivation, and also variability to which they naturally plan. So you get people who are in different quadrants of the interaction, if you like, between high and low motivation, high and low intention, and high and low planning, naturally. And so the intervention will differentially influence those different kinds of people. And so to systematically evaluate, this is not a systematic test of that. So to systematically evaluate that, what you would need is to divide people into those different groups and then test the interaction effect, the the single effect and the interaction effect of both intervention types on those specific groups, yeah, relative to their sort of baseline level. Maybe better still would be to kind of manipulate their levels of motivation and their levels of planning before, and see whether the interventions help maintain that. Right. So that's a couple of ideas, and that work we've not done it, and I don't know of a study that has. So I think those would be very important to do, and I think it could be done relatively easily, experimentally. So, yeah. I forgot the second question.
Yeah, but the complexity of the behavior.
Oh, yes.
Change physical activity behavior may be a bit more complex than reducing driving on food, water. I don't know, maybe. What do you think?
I think so. They're all quite complex behaviors, you know, alcohol as well, you know. So, again, I don't know. I don't know. We didn't code the behaviors in the meta-analysis for complexity. Now, I know that has been done because I've done it for other studies, for other meta-analyses, where you would code the behavior, the target behavior in each study for its level of complexity, you know, how many sub-actions there are, for example. And so you could probably, and you know, there's a clear difference between something like, I don't know, brushing your teeth, right, for example, and physical activity, absolutely. And so if you could come up with some sort of rudimentary comparison or rudimentary coding of studies targeting different behaviors and make those comparisons, that would be worthwhile. And I don't know whether that's been done. And maybe an updated meta-analysis might be able to show that. So the short answer is I don't know whether the complexity would be a moderator.
Good question.
Yeah, very good question. More questions than answers, actually.
Thank you for this very stimulating talk. I've been working on mental imagery myself, so I was really interested. But bouncing on the question of the task, I was wondering, well, the behavior that are targeting our desirable behavior, I would say, or positively evaluated in a society, okay? Change, eat healthier or just move more, etc. I'm working on a project on eating insects, and for many people it's just yuck, you know. It conveys disgust. So I was just trying to imagine how this technique of mental imagery could be used, knowing that the targeting behavior, which is that insects becomes like a daily food, you know, how, or would it be feasible, and how we could implement this technique of mental imagery?
Good question. I think it would depend where you live.
I mean, in Europe.
Of, yeah, I was going to say. Yeah, absolutely. No. You know what? I think this probably relates back to some of Bandura's work, actually. And I think possibly this could be part of those kinds of interventions where, for example, you would use graduated imagery, just like Bandura used gradual vicarious experience, slowly introduce, for example, snake phobics to the idea of even looking at snakes, let alone touching, handling, and so on. And so you could use it as part of those kinds of intervention where you gradually introduce the idea. I think probably not mental simulations, because that tends to be a kind of, you know, delivered by apps, mobile phones, that kind of stuff, or text-based. But if it was used carefully with a facilitator or, yeah, some sort of therapist who would use mental imagery in conjunction with other forms of vicarious experience, that could be part of changing that kind of behavior. It's a very specific behavior. Yeah. And also it's could be tied up with, you know, phobic kinds of perceptions and beliefs.
Well, my question could be more general. Well, thank you for your answer first, but my question could be more general about whether this technique can be used for a behavior that is not that socially desirable.
Yeah, I think so. Strictly speaking, it can be used for any behavior, just like therapy can be used for any behavior. But this is one where I think the mode of delivery becomes very interesting, actually. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, a quick question also for mental simulation. You talked about two types, process and outcome. So maybe in your meta-analysis, did you evaluate which one works better to change health behavior?
Yes, we did.
Yeah, and so
Process.
process. Okay, because it's more precise.
Yeah, and it's more focused on the steps that you need to take, whereas the outcome, focusing on the outcome, doesn't provide you with a mental model as to how you get there. So, I mean, Pham and Taylor were kind of saying, well, you should have both in your intervention, but the process seems to be generally more effective. One of the interesting questions, which I don't think has been addressed, is when one is more effective than the other, or whether furnishing a process simulation with an outcome simulation is more effective, less effective, or the same. In other words, does outcome do anything, right? And Pham and Taylor argued that that's the case. And actually, there are interventions that show that outcome interventions or outcome mental simulation interventions are effective on their own. We've done one, but the effects are relatively modest.
And did you evaluate also the mode of delivery? So between online and with therapist?
No, we didn't have enough data on.
Okay.
There weren't enough online.
Usually it's online. Yeah.
Yeah.
Could be interesting.
Read the study.
Yeah, I will think about it. Thank you.